Well, good morning. Welcome to Reynolda Church. If I haven't had a chance to meet you before, my name is Chris. I serve as our executive pastor. Our senior pastor is away this weekend in Alabama leading a conference. He'll be back in the pulpit next weekend. I trust that you had a great Thanksgiving. At our house, Thanksgiving is an enormous deal. Not only do we have the family meal, but the morning of Thanksgiving, we really kind of start our Christmas festivities. We have waffles and bacon and homemade whipped cream, and then followed by the parade and the dog show and football. Somewhere in there we sneak a nap, and then we go and have a family meal that night. We really enjoy Thanksgiving at our house. And you know, one of the reasons we enjoy Thanksgiving is because it kind of celebrates America's favorite sin, gluttony, right? I mean, just be honest. That's one of the reasons we love it, is because you can eat as much as you want to on Thanksgiving and nobody judges you at all. We prepare for it at my house. Like usually on the morning, I'm a 4 waffle kind of guy, but not on Thanksgiving morning. On Thanksgiving morning, cut back, reserve space. It's a 2 waffle kind of day. This year, I've lost about 40 pounds. I'm pretty happy about that, and I had to buy new clothes and new pants, and I've been excited about that. But one of the things I did was I kept some of my heavy pants just for Thanksgiving Day. So I wore to my mother-in-law's house pants that are 2 inches too big for me because I wanted to have room for all of the food I was going to eat. You know, one of the other things that makes me love Thanksgiving? No one judges you on Thanksgiving Day. Like, it's perfect. You can eat as much as you want to, and then just at that moment when you're completely full, breaking out in the meat sweats, you can lay down and take a nap anywhere you want to. It's the greatest thing about Thanksgiving. You just eat as much as you want to, lay down in the floor, lay down on a family member's couch, lay down on a stranger's couch. It doesn't matter. No one goes by and talks about how lazy you are on Thanksgiving Day. They're kind of proud of you. If you've eaten so much that you've passed out, people walk by and said, "Looks like he must be enjoying his holiday." Hope you had a great Thanksgiving. We're in the midst of our series called Let Nothing You Dismay. It's about how Christmas takes care of our fear. Are you ready for some good news? There's no need to fear God. He hears you and He knows what's best. A few weeks ago, I was speaking at a local college, and I was doing something that God gives me an opportunity to do frequently, and that is to go and kind of defend the historicity of the New Testament. And I opened my time with them by praying a prayer that I pray dozens of times here. It goes something like, Lord God, we thank you for your gospel, and we're thankful for all of Scripture tells one story about one man who interrupted human history to save even one sinner. And his name is Jesus. And so I prayed that prayer, and then I got into talking about manuscripts and all the things I love to talk about. And at the end of it, I'd taken some questions, and one of the guys came up to me, kind of 3 or 4 questions into our time, and he said, "Did you really believe what you prayed there?" I said, "Well, what do you mean?" He said, "Do you really believe that the only reason the Old Testament exists is to tell us about Jesus?" I said, "Well, that's not exactly what I prayed. But what I do believe is that the story of the Old Testament is Jesus' story. It's about a people of God that God carved out of human history to bless them through a series of covenants so that He could reveal to the world His only begotten Son." And he said, "That's fascinating that you believe that." And that's what we preach every week here at Reynolda, is that we believe that the Bible tells the story of one man who came to save sinners. And the Old Testament is full of types and shadows and stories that help us point to the moment when the Messiah would come. And then the New Testament is full of the stories of Jesus' person and ministry on earth. And the Gospels for us then are 4 different portraits of the one man Jesus, and tell us about what we need to know to have a relationship with Jesus' Father. One of the things I love about the Gospels is it's full of miracles. So somewhere around 35 unique miracles are recorded in the Gospels. Now, some of them are repeated 2 or 3 times, but there are 35 unique miracles. And the Gospel of Luke, which is where we're turning our attention today, has 20 of those miracles. The definition of a miracle is this: it's entirely supernatural. Meaning there's no logical, rational, naturalistic explanation for what the miracle is. A miracle is a solely divine act of God in human history. It can't be explained away other than to say that God did it. They are inexplicable by natural law and human thought. Thus, miracles do exactly what they're designed to do. They reveal that God has intervened. And never has God so powerfully intervened in his history than he did at the time of Jesus' arrival. There's never been a time in human history where there were so many miracles, so many supernatural events surrounding one event. Beginning with the fact that God put the seed in the belly of a virgin so that she could bear the Christ who would come and live with us, fully God, fully man, and make a way for sinners to have access to the Father. But in doing that, that event was surrounded by miracles. Like I said, the New Testament Gospels have about 35 unique miracles. But the Gospel of John tells us that there were so many miraculous events during the time of Jesus that all the books of the world couldn't contain them. This is a season during the history of the world where miracles were happening all the time. And this is unique. This week in my study of this, I noticed maybe for the first time, there aren't actually that many miracles in the Old Testament. Like, it's very clear that God's providentially ruling over his people, moving them and shaping them and intervening on their behalf. So God's providentially certainly leading in the Old Testament. But there aren't really that many miracles. I mean, there are certainly miracles in the story, for instance, of Moses, parting of the Red Sea, providing for manna, the plagues. Are definitely miracles that surround the stories of Elijah and Elisha. These prophets' public ministry were full of and validated by miracles. Daniel's story has at least one miracle in it. I mean, some might say that the lion's den was not necessarily a miracle, but maybe it was. But Daniel in the fire furnace is certainly a miracle. But what happens is that there are instances of the miraculous in the Old Testament for sure, but then they abruptly stop. Elijah and Elisha are about 800 years before Luke writes his gospel. Daniel is about 500 years before Luke. The last king of Judah, Zechariah, and his prophet Jeremiah, and then the last writing in the Old Testament, Malachi, that happens 400 years before Luke. And it abruptly stops. No more miracles, no more angels. God's silent. It seems that the earth is groaning in new ways, and what we're waiting on is a new prophet. In Malachi 3, as he's bringing his book to an end, writes these words: "Behold, I send my messenger, and he will prepare the way before me. And the Lord whom you seek will suddenly come to his temple. And the messenger of the covenant in whom you delight, behold, he is coming, says the Lord." This is a prophetic promise from Malachi that says that there will be a moment where the silence that is to come between the Old and the New Testament will be interrupted by God sending someone into human history that will proclaim the coming of the Messiah. And so Israel waited decade after decade, century after century. And then we get to Luke chapter 1. Turn there with me today. As you're turning there, I want to note that Luke was not an eyewitness of the work of Jesus. There's some chance that Mark wasn't either. There's some dispute about whether or not Mark was an eyewitness. Mark was a disciple of Peter and thus wrote the Gospel of Mark, and it really, some of us consider it to be Peter's account. Luke, on the other hand, was discipled by Paul. Paul, who on the road to Damascus had an encounter with Jesus is blinded, converted, becomes one of the great preachers and writers about Jesus that ever lived. He began to disciple people himself, began to lead people to the Lord himself, began to start churches himself. And one of the people that he led to the Lord was a guy named Luke. Luke was just a guy who lived in a city. He'd gone to medical school. He was a physician. People would come to him when they were sick, and he probably attended one of Paul's churches. And during that time, Paul began to disciple him, spend one-on-one time with him. He might have been in Paul's community group. They may have studied the Bible together each week, like some of you do together. And then eventually Luke came to saving faith. But Luke at his heart was a scientist, a historian. Facts mattered. So when Luke began to write the account both of Jesus and the church, remember Luke not only writes Luke, but he also writes Acts. Luke, Acts kind of is one story together. It's my favorite gospel. When he begins to write the historical account of Jesus of Nazareth, he has Paul, he has other eyewitnesses, but what he is particularly interested in is making sure he gets the details right. And one of the ways he gets the details right in writing his account of Jesus is he includes an enormous amount of miracles. I find this contrary, honestly, to some of the ways I live. I believe that miraculous happens. And I want to live in a church and work in a church and worship with my children in a church that has the expectancy that the supernatural still happens today. But honestly, when I'm out defending my faith, when I'm out talking to college kids or talking to people who don't believe in Jesus, I'm kind of intentional about leaving out the miraculous. One of the reasons is that we live in a culture that's really suspicious of miraculous things. Many people don't believe that the miraculous even happens. Reasons overtaken what their heart might say, and instead of believing that miraculous can happen, they try to explain that away. So when I go in, it becomes an intellectual exercise sometimes, defending the manuscripts, defending the historicity of the New Testament and who Jesus was and what Jesus claimed. Sometimes in our culture, we try to explain our faith absent the miraculous. In the first century, that's not what happened. In fact, Luke says, you can believe what I believe about Jesus because of the miraculous. The miracles were there to validate that God had in fact intervened. And so here, Luke is writing an account of what he has learned from Paul and what Paul had learned from the other disciples and experienced himself when he was interrupted on his way to murder other Christians. And he's sharing that with Luke, and Luke is writing that down and telling this story. And Luke begins to fill his gospel with miraculous encounters. But what's interesting is there hadn't been any miracles. And he writes this. In the days of Herod, king of Judea, there was a priest named Zechariah of the division of Abijah, and he had a wife from the daughters of Aaron, and her name was Elizabeth. Time in history is identified in verse 5 as the days of Herod the king. This would have been somewhere in the year 37 BC to 4 BC. Herod led for about 33 years there, and he dies in 2 BC, meaning Jesus was probably born around 3 BC, near the end of Herod's reign, 400 years after the last prophet. And Herod ruled over a region of the Jews. He wasn't a Caesar, he wasn't a king, he was much more like what we would consider a governor or a mayor. And he ruled over a region of the Jews, and he was frequently called the King of the Jews, a title that would later be used to mock Jesus, the true King of the Jews. And he was from the line of Esau. What you need to know about the Bible is that from the very beginning, when Jacob and Esau, they came out of the womb fighting, and they fought every year, every generation. The line of those two guys, Jacob the father of Israel and Esau the father of the Edomites, they continued to fight. And even in the story of Herod the Edomite, he's still trying to kill the Jewish king. As a matter of fact, he sends out an edict that the babies have to be all murdered. This is his last kind of effort to murder the true king of Israel. And so they've been fighting generation after generation after generation, and he orders the slaughter of the firstborn sons, trying to kill the true king of the Jews. It's been 400 years at this moment since the last prophet, 500 years since the last heavenly visitor, 800 years since we saw prophets surrounded by the miraculous, and all of a sudden angels begin to appear. All of a sudden miracles start happening at an unprecedented pace in an effort to confirm the arrival of Jesus the God-man. And Luke makes an intentional effort surround his birth narrative of Jesus with miracles. What I find staggering about the biblical account of Jesus' arrival is there's no fanfare. There's no fanfare. Angels appear to random shepherds, random kingmakers in the Orient. He's born in a stable. He's born to no one. And John the Baptist is a very similar guy. He's going to be Zechariah's son. And the scriptures call Zechariah an ordinary man. You know, I find it fascinating if you were to juxtapose this to the king, for instance, of England or the prince of England having a baby. When it's announced that they're going to have a baby, people begin to gather outside the hospital. They begin to sell memorabilia and people wave flags. There are no baby Jesus' coming coffee cups, I promise you. There's no fanfare around this. This is as ordinary as it gets. Aaron is from the priestly tribe. He's one of 18,000 priests from the line of Aaron. He's just a guy, proving once again that God miraculously works through just people. Just ordinary people. Verse 6 says, "And they were both righteous before God and walked blameless in all the commandments and the statutes of the Lord." This is important because we find out that they are old and have no children. They had sought the Lord. They had prayed to the Lord. They had pled to the Lord. They probably made unrighteous vows to the Lord. Just give us a child. Give us a man in our life that we can continue our priestly lineage. And the scriptures point out that they were above reproach. They were righteous before God. They were walking blameless in all the commandments and the statutes of the Lord. I think sometimes when things aren't going our way or the Lord's not answering our prayer as quickly as possible, our mind pretty quickly begins to believe the lie of our enemy, which is that God doesn't bless us because there's something that we haven't done. If we could just do more, say more, act the right way, do the right things, keep more rules, that God would be more likely to bless us. And the truth is that because of Jesus, God's heart has already been turned towards his children. And here we see in the story of Zechariah that he is blameless. So the fact that God hasn't yet given him a child, hasn't yet answered his prayer, hasn't yet filled that void in Elizabeth's soul, has nothing to do with their righteousness. It was always about God's timing. Verse 7, "But they had no child because Elizabeth was barren and both were advanced in years," probably around 80 at this point, maybe as young as 70. And there was no hope of them having a child at this point outside of supernatural, miraculous intervention. The problem was that hadn't happened in 400 years. They knew the stories. They knew the prophets. They knew that Malachi was the last writer, that God had been silent for 400 years. The only thing that could solve their predicament was miraculous intervention, yet that hadn't happened in 400 years, 10 generations. Now, while he was, verse 8, was serving as priest before God when his division was on duty, I mentioned that he was one of 18,000 priests. Those 18,000 priests would have been divided into 24 divisions, and each of those divisions would have taken 2 different weeks of service at the temple. So twice a year, their division from their town would have gone to the temple in Jerusalem, and they would have been in charge during that week of performing all of the priestly duties for the temple. So 50 weeks a year, he's in his town. And twice a year, his division, one of 24, made up of 18,000 people, would travel to Jerusalem, and during that time, they would provide for the needs of the temple. Honestly, they were primarily butchers. They stood outside in the gates of in the temple of the Israelites, and they made blood sacrifices morning and evening, morning and evening. And these divisions were named for the grandsons of Aaron, and so he was from the order of Abijah, who was one of Aaron's grandsons. Verse 9 says, "According to the custom of the priesthood, he was chosen by lot to enter the temple of the Lord and burn incense." This is an enormous deal. Twice a year, his division would go up to the temple, and they would perform the priestly duties during that week. And every day they would cast a lot for one of the priests to be able to enter into the temple and to provide the incense offering. Now here's what's the deal. This was an unbelievable honor. Such an honor that you could only do it one time in your entire life. They would cast lots. If your name was picked, you could go in and you could light the incense offering, but that was the only time you could ever do it in your whole life. This is the day that Zechariah gets to do the thing he'd longed to do. It's important that you understand the way the temple's set up. The temple door faces the east, and on the outside is basically the court for women and Gentiles. There's something called the portico too, but for our discussion, there's the the court of the women and Gentiles outside. Just inside the temple, there would be a section called the court of the Israelites, meaning the court of the Israelite men. They could go inside, and this is where the priests would provide the blood sacrifice both morning and evening. Deeper inside the temple, there was a special section that was really reserved only for the priestly tribe. And there were two sections of it. We've talked about this before. The front section was called the Holy Place, and the back section was called the Holy of Holies. They were divided by a large veil. And the only person who could go into the back section, the Holy of Holies, was the high priest. And he would only go in there on the Day of Atonement. On the Day of Atonement, he would go into the Holy of Holies and provide a sacrifice and spread the blood of an innocent lamb on the mercy seat to cover the sins of Israel for the next year. And then the next year, he would go in again. So year after year, the high priest would go into the Holy of Holies. The holy place, which was the room just in front of it, had some things in there, but the most important was the altar for incense. And once a day, sometimes twice a day, the priest whose lot had been cast would go in there and offer the incense. Now, the deal is that they'd never been in there before. You got to go in there one time in your entire life. So this was Zechariah's day. That morning he gets up, he's going to be a butcher. Instead, they cast a lot. His name comes up. He's getting to go in there, and he's going to be able to burn the incense for the Lord on this day. So on that day, he would go in and he would gather a golden bowl with hot coals. He would carry the golden bowl in. He would set it on the incense altar, and then he would spread the incense on, and the incense would rise up out of the temple as an aroma of praise to the Lord. The book of Hebrews in the New Testament tells us that not only we learn that the temple of the altar of incense is right outside the door for the Holy of Holies. So you're looking at the huge veil. The huge veil that separates man from God. The huge veil that separates God being behind in the Holy of Holies and us being out in the holy place. And he's standing there looking at this huge veil, and he knows that he's got to be careful because there was a custom that when the high priest would go into the Holy of Holies, they would tie bells around his feet so they could hear him walking around to know that he hadn't died. And if he did die, they could not dare go get him. So they would tie a rope around his foot so if he went in there and died and they heard the bells stop ringing, they could drag his body back out because no one dare go in the Holy of Holies except for the high priest. This is the most sacred place where God meets with his priest to make a way for the sins of the people. And right outside the door, the place that you might die in, is this altar. And he brings the gold bowl in, he sits it down, the hot coals are in there simmering, he pours on the incense, and it smokes to the heavens. Hebrews tells us that on the Day of Atonement, this incense played a role. In fact, he would not only, the high priest, take in the lamb that would be sacrificed for the sins of Israel, but he would also take that incense in there. And Hebrews says he would sprinkle it on the holy seat in the Holy of Holies as well. So in some ways, this incense is inseparable from the Holy of Holies. And so Zechariah, this is his day. He's waited his entire priestly life. It's very likely that he had heard his father or Elizabeth's father tell about their day that they got to go in. The morning that they got up and their name came up and they went in there and were able to have access to God. And so here, this is his day. And he goes in with the golden bowl, sprinkles the incense. The aroma reaches to the heaven. And it says that there was a whole multitude of people that were outside praying during this hour. This is probably the evening sacrifice because of the crowd. And it says in verse 11 that there appeared to him an angel of the Lord standing on the right side of the altar of incense. I cannot express to you enough how out of the ordinary it is for an angel to show up. 400 years of silence. 500 years since a heavenly visitor. 800 years since a season of miracles happened. And Zechariah goes in on his one special day. But I promise he doesn't want to linger. He goes in, drops the incense, turns around, makes sure he takes everything in so he can share the story. And he's getting ready to run out. Stay in there too long, they might have to drag you out with the rope. So he's not going to be in there very long. And an angel appears. And it says in verse 12, Zechariah was troubled when he saw him, and fear fell upon him. This seems to be the constant story of Scripture, that an angel shows up and people get afraid. So all of the pictures that you have of angels dressed in diapers as small babies, that's not the angels that these people are engaging, right? You don't rub the angel on the head and tell it it's cute or tickle its belly. That's not what you do to an angel in the Bible. When they show up, people are afraid. Zechariah has the same reaction that Gideon has in Judges 6 when a heavenly visitor confronts him. It's the same reaction that Manoah has. This is the father of Samson in Judges 13. In fact, he says, we're going to die. It's the same reaction that Isaiah has when he gets a glimpse of the angels singing and says, holy, 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 and then he immediately condemns himself. It's the same reaction that Ezekiel has, the prophet in the first chapter of Ezekiel, who saw an indescribable presence of the glories of the throne of God and said, when I saw it, I fell on my face. It's the same reaction that Daniel has in both chapter 8 and 10 when Daniel was confronted with a heavenly visitor. It's the same reaction that Mary has when she was greatly troubled and told to not be afraid. It's the same reaction that the shepherds have in Luke 2 when they're told to not be afraid. It's the same reaction when the disciples in Matthew 17 are told to not be afraid. And it's the same reaction that we see in the book of Revelation when John sees the angels and he fell at his feet as a dead man. But the angel said to Zechariah, do not be afraid, for your prayer has been heard, and your wife Elizabeth will bear you a son, and you shall call his name John. And you will have joy and gladness, and many will rejoice at his birth, for he will be great before the Lord. John's name meant God's favor. For the angel of the Lord to tell Zechariah to not be afraid is absolutely absurd. It's completely consistent with the way that everyone reacts when they encounter an angel. It's also completely consistent with how a human would react when they encountered an angel. It's also absolutely consistent with how anyone who wasn't expecting the miraculous because they hadn't seen it for 400 years would react when a supernatural heavenly being shows up standing next to you on your one special day in the temple. A couple weeks ago, I went to Chicago. They had announced several years ago that Wake Forest would play at Notre Dame in the fall of 2015. And I was so excited about it. I love Notre Dame. But we didn't have real cable growing up, so on Saturday, you watch the Notre Dame game on NBC. I love Notre Dame. I love Touchdown Jesus. I love the Golden Dome. I love the fact that they pray on the intercom system to Jesus before. There's a lot of things to love about Notre Dame. So my friend and I, we decided that when they announced the game, we were going to go. And so here we are. This violates one of my major rules in life, which is to avoid flying. But we're going to fly to Chicago. We're going to take the train out to South Bend, and we were going to watch the game. So here we went a couple weeks ago. And once again, I hate to fly. It makes no sense to me. Something that heavy and that big should fall out of the sky. And so I'm holding on to the armrest because I don't want to sit next to the window, because the windows, that's how you see that the plane's falling out of the sky. So I want to be in the aisle, but I got the window and I'm holding on the armrest so tight that it's very clear that the person sitting next to me has noticed that my fingers no longer have any blood in them. And so this person next to me reaches over their hand and puts it on my arm and says, it's going to be okay. You know what my first thought was? You don't know my fear. That doesn't make me feel any better. As a matter of fact, it makes me feel worse because you're a 13-year-old girl and you're telling me not to be afraid. And so this little 13-year-old girl puts her hand on my arm and tells me not to be afraid. And the only thing I could think, honestly, is to look at her and say, you don't know how afraid I am. You don't know enough as a 13-year-old to be afraid of what's really happening here. I'm so much smarter than you, and I understand things so much greater than you. That if you knew what I knew, you'd be afraid too. You don't know what I know. There's got to be something in Zechariah that when the angel shows up and says, don't be afraid, he's like, you got to be kidding me, right? You telling me not to be afraid? You're a supernatural heavenly being that no one's seen for 500 years. You show up on my one special day, tell me not to be afraid. This is exactly what I should be, is afraid. And what the angel knows is that John the Baptist, the new prophet, who's going to come and proclaim, prepare the way of the Lord. He is the Lamb who takes away the sins of the world, is going to come to Zechariah and Elizabeth, who had long since given up hope that they'd ever have a baby. What the angel is saying is, not your fear isn't rational, but that your fear is about to be solved. Not that your fear isn't founded, but I'm about to give you the solution. Fear not, because I'm going to give you the baby. I'm proclaiming that the baby has come. Jesus is going to make a way miraculously for you to have the child you've longed for. And in doing so, what's going to happen is this veil is going to be torn. More on that in a minute. Zechariah's fear clearly points us to the Lord, because it reminds us that God's timing is perfect. God answers every prayer, yes, no, or not now. But God is faithful to answer the prayers of His people, yes, no, or not now. The answer to Zechariah and Elizabeth's plea wasn't yes, it wasn't no, it was not now. And the reason was God's timing is perfect. 400 years of silence, 500 years since there was a miraculous appearance of an angel, 800 years since there had been a season of the miraculous. And here God is working in them and through them. God's timing is perfect because what He needed to happen is just the right time, at just the right place. God would give Zechariah the word he needed, the answer to his prayer, to save sinners through his son the prophet who would proclaim the coming of the Messiah. Be not dismayed if God hasn't answered yet. The answer may be, not yet. But here's what happens in the soul of the believer as they begin to trust more and more God's faithfulness, God's character, God's steadfastness to His own promises. What happens is over and over again we're able to say, I trust that whether the answer to my prayer is yes, no, or not now, God's character is so for me that if He says yes, it's God's best for me. If it's no, it's God's best for me. If He says not now, I'll wait till it's God's best for me. And that's what Zechariah knew. So when God comes to him through His angel and promises him that he'll have a child, his not now has come. And it was in God's perfect timing to reveal to the world His only begotten Son. But the other way that God deals with our fears, other than always answering our prayers, the other way that God deals with our fears is He reminds us that ultimately we fear God in the sense that He is sovereign and we trust Him and He is big and merciful and just. But we don't fear God as if we don't know what God is up to. We don't fear God in the way that we do when there's uncertainty. The Christmas promise proclaimed by the angel, and why the angel felt so confident to tell him, fear not, was to remind him that the very thing that he feared in that moment was about to be destroyed. Not only does he fear the angel who stands there, but he fears that he might die in this holy place. And so what the angel of the Lord is reminding Zechariah of is there's going to be a moment when this division between you and the Holy of Holies, you and God who sits in there, you and sins that need to be atoned for only by the blood of an innocent lamb year after year after year, that division that's there, that's about to be destroyed, because there's going to be a day when Jesus of Nazareth is going to lay himself on the mercy seat. The one true Lamb of God, the one true Israelite, he's going to come and he's going to lay himself on the mercy seat. He's going to be the great high priest. He's going to lay himself on a cross and allow his innocent blood to be shed once and for all. And when that happens, so that no one ever thinks again that that veil divides people from access to God, on the moment in which he surrenders his spirit, on the moment when Jesus defeats sin and death on the cross at Calvary, in an earthquake of supernatural proportions, the veil of the temple that divided Zechariah from the Holy of Holies is going to be torn from top to bottom, lest anyone think it was a natural act. No man could have done it. Only God could have ripped it that way. And in that moment, the veil is pulled back. And Zechariah and you and me have access to God. We no longer have reason to fear, because Jesus took the wrath that was due us for our rejection of God. And in doing so, taking our place, taking our sin upon us, ripping the veil for us. He's given us unfettered access to the God who created the universe. You can go to your God and surrender your fear to him, knowing that he can conquer it, because his heart towards you is to bless you and prosper you and put you on high places. Know this, the same Jesus who offers himself as the sacrificial lamb so the veil can be torn, so the fear can go away, is with you this day. What do you fear? Do you fear uncertainty? Do you fear judgment? Do you fear abandonment? Christmas stirs up in all of us all of those fears, all of those uncertainties, all of the ways we failed, all of the ways we can't provide, all of the ways we don't measure up. Christmas stirs it up in us because we feel more vulnerable when we're around the people in our families and our friends and we're celebrating. If they knew us, if they knew the way we felt about ourselves, if they knew the way that we just didn't measure up, if they knew the sins of our past or the hidden sins that we're in right now, if they knew us, they would reject us. The promise of Christmas is that God came and started a sentence that he finished with a period on Easter morning. The story of Christmas is that Jesus came so that he could live the life that we never lived and die the death that we should have died, so that Easter morning he could be raised from the dead, give us access to the Holy of Holies now and forevermore. And everything that was rightfully his is now ours. And through his Spirit that raised him on Sunday morning, we can conquer fear and death. You have no reason to fear. God is for you. And if he's for you, who can be against you? And that's the gospel.